Good morning. Thanks for coming to class week 3. I'm Chef JD here with Chef Rose, and we are ready to talk all things gluten-free, in addition to building storm shelters and talking about the meaning of life, right? Hopefully nobody was confused by my message last night. I got a couple messages from my other class where people are like, what are you talking about? We're building a nuclear fallout shelter? Said, no, I'm just kidding. That's just me trying to be funny. No, we're just talking about pastries, incidentally. So how's it going? Does anybody have anything super interesting to say or any big questions before we get started with class? I fielded a lot of questions over the weekend, over the past few days, so please don't be afraid to speak up if you've got something to say. No? Somebody had fun with last week's assignment? That's good. Yeah, you had pretty much free reign of, whatever, some kind of local product of your choice with a fruit dessert. I know a couple people didn't understand the fruit dessert requirement and made other things, but that's okay, Make sure that when you're looking at the assignments and you're listening to us, you really, listen to what the requirements are, but things like that, it's not that big of a deal at this point. But anyway, we're going to go over the assignment from last week. We're going to talk about baker's percentage just real quick, because I did have a bunch of questions about baker's percentage and some confusion about that. And then we're going to talk about baking gluten-free. Today I do have a slideshow prepared. I like teaching from the little presentation so that you have something to look at other than me. But I did get some new eyeshadow, if you guys like it. But anyway, so let me know if you like it or not. I'll change the color if you don't for next class. Thank you. Thanks. I think it's cute too. It's NYX. Anyway, so let's talk about the assignment that was due last night. You had to provide at least one local product from your surrounding area and add it into some sort of a fruit dessert. So I had lots of questions about what local products are and everything, and hopefully you're able to find that. We had eggs, honey, fruits, different types of vegetables, zucchinis, things of that nature, and then you're supposed to incorporate it into a fruit dessert. So Chef Rose is going to talk to you about what she saw and what she liked and what she didn't like and what she hopes to see in the future. So take it away with that.
All right, so I saw lots of really fun creative desserts. So far I haven't seen any that were not technically fruit desserts, but I saw a lot of creativity in just kind of like whether you made a cookie or a bar, or I saw somebody made like a creme brulee with goat's milk, which I thought was really creative, local goat's milk, which was awesome. She got to visit the goats and everything. I don't remember which student that was, but it looked like a lot of fun. I saw a few of you venture out and kind of talk to your neighbors, which I thought was really cool. So a couple of you got chicken eggs from neighbors. I saw somebody got like figs off of their neighbor's tree, which was really interesting, and kind of just like as local as you possibly can get is your neighbor's backyard. So I just thought that was really cool to see. But then a few people visited farmers markets, which was awesome to get local fruit. I learned a lot of you live in Colorado, which I did not know that, because I saw lots of different peach vendors that you guys have gone to that are like in my backyard. So that was kind of cool to see also. So learning a lot about you guys. I do have a few students that I want to show just because I think they found really cool local products, or they made a really interesting type of dessert with it and things like that. So I'm going to share my screen here. And so, can you guys see me okay? Thumbs up? Cool. So first one I've got here is Lindsay, and so she found a local local jam that she used in like a thumbprint cookie, which I thought was really creative. Because I mean, making a fruit dessert, it doesn't have to be like a giant pie or anything. It could be something small and petite and cute and pretty like these are. And so that was really fun to see that she made a little thumbprint cookie with some local jam, and so that was really cool. And so I thought Lindsay did a really great job with that, so fantastic job, Lindsay. Next we've got April here, one of those Colorado natives who found some Palisade peaches, which I don't know if you guys have had Palisade peaches, but they're pretty much the best peaches ever. And she made like a peach crisp with it, which I thought was really good and creative to see there. So that was really cool. And so definitely really yummy. I don't know if you guys are into peaches, but I love peach desserts and I make them all the time. I actually made some last week with the Palisade peaches. So I thought that was really neat. Thank you, April. And then so next we've got here Amy, who found out that her neighbor has some chickens, and so she got some eggs from her neighbor's chickens, which I thought was really cool to see. And that's one that you could really have just about anywhere. Like chickens are pretty local. Honey, you could pretty much find anywhere local, and so I thought that was cool. And so she made a cranberry cookie, cranberry walnut or cranberry white chocolate cookie with those eggs. So fantastic job, Amy. And then certainly last but not least, we've got more peaches from Rosalinda, another local Colorado area. And so that was really neat to see. And so she made like this really cool like granola bar type bar, which I've never actually seen anything like this before. So I thought that was really cool. You can see how clean cut those edges are, just really neat with those peaches in there. Very pretty. And so I think everybody did a fantastic job this week, but those are just a few that I saw that kind of really stood out to me, that I thought they just really went above and beyond with finding those local products, and then they really made something different and kind of unique with those as well. So wonderful job this week. I can't wait to see what you guys do with gluten-free baking. I've already gotten a few texts that you guys are super excited about it, and I'm super excited about it as well. I gluten-free bake a lot, and so it's cool that we're actually going to talk about it now. So can't wait to see what you guys got for me this week.
Awesome, thank you so much. You guys did a really great job. I enjoyed looking at those recipes too, kind of made me hungry. I haven't been baking very often, but I hope to get back into it soon. I just moved, so I'm still trying to get my kitchen put together, but really great job. I think that you'll like the assignment this week. We're making a flourless chocolate cake, which is really rich and fudgy, and you can pair it with a lot of different ingredients and make it into a plated dessert, and it's super fun, and lots of restaurants are using this type of product, so it's a good thing to know how to make. Before we jump into that, I wanted to talk about baker's percentage for a few minutes, because I have been getting a bunch of questions that people have forgotten how to do that, and whether or not you figured it out between then and now. Let's just chat about it real quick. You want to, if you're going to do the baker's percentage and you need to find a percentage of a particular ingredient, you just take the weight of that ingredient and you divide it by the total weight of the flour, and then you multiply that answer by 100, and that's it. That's all you do. I'm going to screen share a little example for you. Okay, so this is the formula right here. The ingredient weight divided by the total flour weight times 100. And the times 100 part is just to break it down into decimal form. That's the reason why we do that. Flour is always 100. And I know what you're thinking, Chef, this week we're not using flour. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's just say that we are. This is our recipe right here. Just for example, we're talking about cocoa. You take the total weight of the cocoa, which is 20 grams. I wrote that right here. Divide it by the total weight of the flour. You get 0.16. And then to convert it into a percentage form, a whole number, you're just going to multiply it by 100 and you get 16. So that's 16%. It's that easy. And then you take that same formula and you do that all the way down for the rest of the ingredients. Now you might say, what if I don't have any flour in my recipe? For example, our recipe this week. You can use sugar as the 100%. So just take this formula, put sugar in instead of flour. Let's say we don't have any flour. And then just do the same thing, but with sugar being 100. So right here for sugar, I'll write 100% instead of your flour. Does that make sense? That's pretty easy. That's a very standard formula. Anybody have questions about that? Okay. All right.
Chef, there was a question in the chat about how do you get the weight if you have the percentage but not the weight?
Okay, I'll pull up another document that I have a couple other formulas for, which I can attach to the class page, or I can email it or message it to everybody, but it's really handy. It's in my, I'm going to screen share again. It's in my file somewhere. No, it's in my email. Where is it? Okay. Somebody was just asking me about that yesterday. Okay. Sorry, bear with me real quick. Sorry, I don't know where it is. Just can we just get back to that in a few minutes? I don't want to waste too much time looking for that email. We can talk about that at the end of the session, if that's okay. Is that cool? Because there's two more formulas for baker's percentage, and I'd really like to show you the document so that you can kind of get a visual, but I don't want to waste too much time looking for it at the moment. We're going to talk about gluten-free baking, so I'm going to play a real quick video. I think it's a 3 or 4 minute video to show you what gluten is and what it looks like before we even talk about gluten-free baking, so that you kind of have an idea of what the product is. And basically, this is going to be a man mixing some flour and water together and then rinsing it off like he's making a bread dough, and then he's going to rinse it off, and it's going to end up with a ball of sticky goo, which is what gluten is. Can anybody tell me what the two proteins are that create gluten? Can I pick on somebody? Is David there? Does David know? How about Jessica? No? There's two proteins in wheat flour called glutenin and gliadin. And when you mix them together with moisture, which would be water, it creates gluten. And gluten is that stretchy substance, that sticky substance that holds together breads and cakes. It's what gives them its structure. And gluten is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that, you know, some people are allergic to it. It bothers their bodies, and we're gonna go into that. But when you hear the word gluten, especially nowadays, it's kind of like a trigger word. It's like a hot button issue. Gluten is bad, gluten is bad. It's not bad, it's just, you know, it's like anything else. It's like dairy or peanuts. You know, some people just can't process it. It hurts their bodies. So I'm gonna play the video for you, and while I'm playing the video, I'll look for that baker's percentage thing, and then we'll look at my slideshow. Okay, can everybody see my screen? I think that I need to put the sound on. Okay, here it is.
We use wheat flour in countless recipes, from chewy loaves of rustic bread and pizza dough to tender cakes and some muffins. All of these baked goods rely on something called gluten. How does this work? First, let's start with a simple question. What is gluten? All wheat flours contain two important proteins, glutenin and gliadin. Now, in the presence of water, these two small proteins change shape and bond together. This creates an elastic network of proteins called gluten, which has the ability to trap air, much like a balloon. This gluten network fills with swollen starch granules and gas bubbles, allowing breads to rise and cakes to gain some gentle structure. Now, here in the test kitchen, we've long known that gluten is important in baking, but mainly we've done a lot of talking, not a lot of showing. So what is it on a tangible level? Can you see it? Can you feel gluten? I ran a simple experiment to find out just that. I made 2 basic doughs by mixing flour and water in a food processor until a smooth ball formed. Now for one dough, I used cake flour, which contains the least amount of protein of all the different types of flour that you can find at the grocery store, between 6 and 8% usually. In addition, cake flour is often bleached, which further weakens the proteins. Now for the other one, I used bread flour, which contains the most amount of protein, usually running about 12 to 14%, and is generally not bleached. So you can see here I have 2 balls of dough, each containing a different amount of gluten. But you can't actually see that, because surrounding that gluten is a whole lot of starch. Now the next step, believe it or not, I washed the starch away. I placed each dough in a mesh strainer and massaged them under running water to wash away all of the starch. Once the water ran clear, a sign that the starch was gone, I was left with 2 piles of essentially pure gluten. As you can see, the differences in appearance and texture of the two are dramatic. The low-protein cake flour formed a very small amount of really weak gluten. You can pull it right apart. On the other hand, high-protein bread flour formed a large ball of highly resilient, rubbery gluten. It can be stretched very thin without tearing. To show just how elastic this bread flour gluten ball is, I'm going to try and do something a little bit crazy. I'm going to treat it like a balloon and inflate it with compressed air.
So that looks kind of gross, right? But that's basically what gluten is. It is, you know, that sticky substance that holds together the baked goods. So why is gluten a bad thing for some people? Can anybody shed some light on that subject? Is anybody in here allergic to gluten or gluten intolerant?
I have a friend that's extremely allergic to gluten. She can't even bake anything without having a mask on because the gluten bothers her that much. But some people, especially if they have like IBS or something like that, or Crohn's disease, can't process the gluten because their body can't break it down.
Right. Yeah, gluten affects people in a lot of different ways. There's so many symptoms, even like infertility issues. It can cause people to, you know, not be able to reproduce, headaches, blindness, skin rashes, indigestion minimally. If you're allergic to gluten, it can cause anaphylactic shock, so that would be life-threatening. But it's important for us to know about these issues in baking because it is a very trendy thing right now to bake gluten-free. So it's good to know what gluten is and why people want to avoid it. So, you know, you have folks who have celiac disease. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, which is basically something that you're born with. And the problem is that when you eat gluten and it goes down into your intestines, the gluten causes the little hairs in your intestines, which are called villi. It causes them to kind of like flatten out. They're usually reaching up to grab the nutrients when food passes through the system, but it causes the villi to like flatten out almost, and then your body can't absorb the nutrients. So not only do you have a host of all kinds of other uncomfortable symptoms, but then your body all of a sudden can't absorb the nutrients from the food that you eat, so you start to become malnourished. People with celiac disease oftentimes have problems gaining weight. They've got sudden unexplained weight loss, things of that nature. So that's the big one, is celiac disease. So when somebody tells you they need gluten-free food because they have celiac disease, they really need it to be 100% gluten-free. And that's one of the reasons why you have to be sure that you're working in an actual gluten-free facility. You know, let's say, for example, you're just baking in your regular bakery or baking out of your house, and somebody with celiac disease or a wheat allergy needs a gluten-free product. You need to thoroughly clean and sanitize your kitchen and all your ingredients, like the cans of everything, the bags, the spatulas, the mixer, the counter. You want to mop your floor, everything before, because even the smallest amount can hurt somebody who has celiac disease or a wheat allergy. Does that make sense? more often than not, the gluten-free products that you buy in the grocery store that say gluten-free, they're going to be produced in a facility that doesn't process wheat at all. Much like the cheese company, Sargento, they started, remember when they started selling those little packets of cheese and nuts together and dried fruit, like little to-go snacks? They actually built a completely separate facility to create these bags with the nuts and the cheese. That way their regular products weren't contaminated with nuts at all. They were able to say that we sell nut-free products. So they built two separate facilities. And that's what gluten-free products do. You don't want to be selling certified gluten-free products when you're working in a kitchen that produces wheat items. Now, if you are selling gluten-free products, but you're not in a certified kitchen, you need to let your customers know that, either by telling them or preferably putting a label on the product that says this product was processed in a kitchen that also processes wheat products, so that they can know that there's a big chance that that product is going to have some gluten somewhere in it, whether it's just a sprinkling or a dusting, but you can't call something actually certified gluten-free if it's not. Any questions about that? I'm going to pull up the slideshow, which is going to take us through what gluten is and what celiac disease is, and then it's also going to pull up a list of a bunch of different flour replacements and talk about how to bake gluten-free. Okay? Any questions before I do that? Nope. All right. Can you see the screen? Awesome. Baking gluten-free. What is gluten? It's, like I said before, it's the combination of those two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, in wheat products. When you mix it with moisture, it creates that stretchy substance like the guy in the video showed you, and that is what gives our baked goods all their structure, their stretchiness, their extensibility. That's what kind of holds them together. So that's what gluten is. It's also important to know that gluten will help your product expand in the oven because it traps air bubbles. You know, like when you're making bread and you go through the two fermentation processes and the bread starts to get puffy because it's trapping gas. And then when you put your bread in the oven, it springs up because the air, you know, the gas inside that's expanding. Gluten helps trap air bubbles. So, you know, like, if you don't have gluten in your product, you might end up with something that's kind of dense and crumbly because it wasn't able to rise the way that it would normally because of the lack of those pockets to hold the gases. Anyway, here's a little chart that kind of shows about what gluten does when it mixes it, you know, when the proteins mix with water. So you've got the gliadin, the glutenin, water, it mixes together and it creates that mesh-like structure, which we saw in the video. So here's a whole list of things that contain gluten. This is, if you're concerned about gluten-free cooking and baking, this list is something that you probably want to keep on you or in your kitchen so that you know when you're cooking what to use and what not to use, and always read your ingredient labels very thoroughly to make sure that they don't contain any of these ingredients. And this is by no means a complete list, but this is kind of like the top types of products that contain gluten. Wheat, also known as durum, gram, semolina, einkorn, spelt. Spelt is not gluten-free. A lot of people say that it is. That's like thrown in there when you're talking about gluten-free baking, but spelt is not gluten-free. Barley, anything that has the word malt in it, barley malt, even beer, malt vinegar, those all have gluten. Pasta, couscous, panko, breadcrumbs, different types of condiments, barbecue sauce. So unless your condiments say gluten-free, don't assume that they are. Like ketchup, for example. Ketchup may not be gluten-free just because it's, you know, ground up tomatoes and whatnot. There might be other additives in there that are used as stabilizers, because we know that gluten is a stabilizer. So they might actually add gluten to the product to cause it to either thicken up or be more stable. So don't just assume something is gluten-free just because you think like, oh, this is made out of, you know, goat's milk or tomatoes or, you know, whatever. It might not be gluten-free. Even candy. Candy has extra gluten put in it to give it some chewiness too, depending on like taffy, things of that nature. So always check your food labels. Okay. Here are the problems with gluten. Not that gluten is a bad thing, like we said before, but here's some reasons why some people are avoiding it. We talked about the celiac disease. I forgot to actually write something in this box here, so don't pay attention to that. But celiac disease was where, you know, the intestines get damaged when a person eats gluten and they're not able to absorb the nutrients anymore. Gluten intolerance, that's usually undiagnosed. Celiac would be treated, diagnosed with a blood test, but gluten intolerance is usually undiagnosed, and it has similar symptoms to celiac disease. And it's usually alleviated, the symptoms are alleviated when somebody eats a gluten-free diet. Gluten allergy could be life-threatening. That's pretty much the definition of an allergy, is that it's possibly life-threatening. So somebody could have anaphylactic shock, their throat could close up, whatever, or they could just experience other symptoms like celiac disease or gluten intolerance. And dieters, people who are dieting, people who want to lose weight. So gluten doesn't make them sick. But usually when you're avoiding gluten-free foods, you are avoiding foods that have a lot of carbohydrates. That's kind of goes hand in hand with a gluten-free diet. Even though a lot of other gluten-free types of flours are still starchy and they have a high glycemic index, which means lots of carbs. More often than not, people who are avoiding gluten are also avoiding carbs in general. So those are like the four main reasons why we're avoiding gluten, or why we want to learn how to bake gluten-free. So according to celiac.org, 1% of the population has celiac disease. And that might not seem like a lot, but just think about it this way, 1 in every 100 people. So if you have a bakery and you get 100 people come in through your door each hour, which would be super awesome, I want a bakery like that. 1 out of every 100 of those people is going to have celiac disease or even some sort of, you know, gluten intolerance or gluten allergy. So it's important to know how to bake and how to avoid gluten. So here's just some more information about celiac disease with some visual aids. Here is the normal lining of the intestine. And then after they eat the gluten, it's destroyed. So they're not like long fingers that absorb the nutrients anymore. They kind of flatten out and the nutrients are not able to be absorbed any longer. So here's a list of common symptoms: digestive pain, bloating, constipation and or diarrhea, vomiting, weight loss, fatigue, anemia, all these things. Canker sores in the mouth, osteoporosis. So, you know, in some people, gluten can actually leach the calcium out of your bones and leave you with weak and brittle bones. Certain types of cancers, lots and lots of different symptoms. I have a little bit of a gluten intolerance and I get bumps on my skin, like on the backs of my arms. And I know that because when I eat gluten-free for a few weeks, the bumps go away. But it doesn't make me sick in any other way. It just gives me a skin rash. Does anybody have a symptom like that, where they can avoid it by eating gluten-free? No? That's good. Maybe it's because there's not 100 people in here. We don't have 1%. Okay. So here are the 5 C's of baking gluten-free. Content, which basically means we need to know if our product that we're using contains gluten. Contact and contamination, or you could say cross-contamination. You need to know how to be aware of that and how to not contaminate the products or the equipment that you're using to bake gluten-free. It hasn't been in contact with gluten. Communication, which would be listening to your customers' needs and asking questions if you need to, and making sure everything is clear before you proceed and before you guarantee them that you can give them a product that is gluten-free. And of course, common sense, which is basically just like, if you don't know, stop, don't serve the product. If you don't know if something has gluten, you need to stop. If there's no way of knowing, like let's say the ingredient label is very unclear and it doesn't say gluten-free and there's just no way of knowing, then just don't use that product. Don't try to risk somebody else's life or their health by proceeding with that. So those are the 4 C's. This one right here is probably, I would talk on it as not being the most important, but it's very important because you, like I said before, you need to know how to clean your kitchen free of gluten before you start cooking. Now, I personally, I don't offer my customers gluten-free products. When I was working in a bakery for several years, or here at the house, like I have like a little side cake business before I moved, but I haven't started that back up again. I haven't offered gluten-free because I just don't feel comfortable guaranteeing anybody that, this place doesn't have gluten. It's not going to find its way into a cupcake or whatever I make. I've got bread here. I bake with flour pretty much, 100% of the time. So there's not really any way for me to guarantee anybody that the product that I give them is not going to have gluten. And that's okay. It really is. It's not like, oh, you don't bake gluten-free, you're the devil. It's a personal preference. And there's so many places nowadays that do bake gluten-free. So if you're not one of them, it's not the end of the world. I'm not saying that I'm against it. It's just that I'm against it because I don't feel comfortable, taking that risk with somebody's health. Anybody have anything to say about that? Does anybody like to bake gluten-free, or you plan on baking gluten-free in the future for your job?
I think some dessert, it's better without gluten. Like the chocolate dessert, it's much better without flour inside. Or I like to substitute a lot with almond flour. I think it's very good in the dessert. Not because allergy, because it tastes, the flavor.
Just the flavor?
Yeah.
I agree. Sometimes flour can kind of dilute the flavor of certain ingredients. Is this like anybody's passion? You're so passionate about it, you're gonna open a gluten-free bakery, or you really want to go work for some place that's gluten-free? Anyway, my point was that, if you don't want to do it, it's not a bad thing. I know that it's super popular nowadays and everybody's doing it, but if you don't want to be one of them, that's just your choice and it's fine. So
I definitely plan on trying because not gluten wise, but I used to work at a Smoothie King, and there was a woman that came in, and herself, her daughter, and her sister had certain allergies, and we couldn't add certain things to their smoothies. I was making a smoothie for one of them, and I knew what needed to go in it, but the manager took the blender from me and just started adding everything that was supposed to go into the smoothie. And when I turned around, she had added nuts to the smoothie, and I said, whoa, wait a minute, this lady's allergic to nuts. And so she picked out maybe 2 or 3 of the nuts and says, it's whatever, I don't care, and tossed the blender onto the thing and gave it to the lady. And I was like, and I never saw that lady again.
You should have said something, Lauren. She probably went.
yeah, that's scary. That's the lack of common sense and communication right there. And definitely cross-contamination too. Somebody who didn't know what they were doing, just using a piece of equipment that was most likely contaminated, not communicating with the other staff members, not communicating with the customer, and using very poor common sense. That is very scary. So yeah, it is important. It's important to know the dangers of it, and it's also really good to speak up. You know, don't be afraid. Once you really learn about this topic, don't be afraid to kind of speak up at work. You know, if you're working back in a bakery and you get a gluten-free order and your boss is like, oh, no problem, let's just dust off the table and make this real fast and get back to our business. You have to speak up and be like, no, we got to shut down. We've got to close down the whole place. We got to sanitize everything. It might not be worth it in the end to make this order, but don't be afraid to, to communicate that, because you could save somebody's life, or you could save them from getting really, really sick. Okay, back to the show. Anyway, 5 C's of baking gluten-free. So what should we expect realistically when baking with gluten? Are we going to be able to provide the customer with a product that's exactly the same as it would be if it did have the wheat flour in it? Should the customers expect that when they get, a gluten-free cake from you, that it's going to taste and have the same mouthfeel exactly like the other type? What do you think? No. You really have to know that gluten-free is a completely different product. Like when you're working with gluten-free flours, it's not wheat flour. So they're 2 separate things. Even though you're making, let's say I'm making 1 cake with wheat flour and 1 cake with gluten-free flour. Sure, they're both cake. Sure, I'm using the same recipe for both, but I'm substituting a completely different product for the wheat, and it's going to end up tasting a little bit different. It's going to have a slightly different mouth feel. It might rise differently. So your customers need to be aware, as do you as the chef or the baker. They're not the same thing. They really aren't. So that's kind of like realistically what we need to share with the customers. So that's what, like I just said, how is your product going to be different? They have a lack of natural structure. And if you don't do it right, it can result in a dense, crumbly baked good if you're not using the right procedures for gluten-free baking. So you need to know that. You need to inform your customers that it's not going to be the same. They shouldn't necessarily be expecting the exact same result. Now, gluten-free products can be really good if you do it right, but they're not always, exactly the same as what it would be like if you were using wheat flour. So just make sure that you know that, and you make your customers aware of the same thing. So when you're replacing gluten, you need to kind of think about what is it about that formula that you're trying to replace from the wheat flour. Are you replacing structure? Like if you're making gluten-free bread, that gluten is providing all the structure and the chewiness and the stretchiness to the dough. So you're probably wanting to replace that wheat flour with a high protein gluten-free type of flour. Now, if you're making a cake or a more like tender pastry, maybe you're replacing the ability to trap gas bubbles so that it can rise when you put it in the oven. Just things of that nature. Think about the function. Think about the actual function of the wheat flour in the product that you're replacing with gluten-free flour, and that'll help you in the process, because there's so many different types of gluten-free flours, and they all pretty much have different functions. In addition to have different functions, they also have different colors and different tastes too, which you need to be aware of. And I do have some handy charts for that coming up. But like, for example, cake has a weak flour. Cake flour is weak. So when you're replacing it with gluten-free flour, you don't necessarily need to use a product that's high in protein. You need to use a product that's high in starch, because you're going to want to, part of that wheat flour, the function of that wheat flour was a dryer and kind of a binder in your cake batter, not necessarily structure, but more of like, it's going to absorb the liquid and help give your batter some substance. Bread, you're going to need a very strong replacement with the high levels of protein. Okay, are there any questions about that? That's kind of a confusing topic when we're talking about ingredient functions. No? Okay. So just expanding on that, like I said before, weaker flours use lower protein replacements. So like if you're using a cake flour or a pastry flour, normally you would find a gluten-free product that had a lower level of protein. And here are some examples: white rice flour, potato starch, tapioca starch, and buckwheat flour. Those are all low protein content flours. It's also good to know that rice flour can be really gritty. So if you are using like 100% rice flour, sure, your product is going to be white, but it's going to have kind of like a gritty and crumbly texture because it's basically just ground up rice. And rice, you know, if you've ever eaten rice before that's not cooked, it's hard. So it's also good to know that tapioca starch and potato starch are very soft and starchy, and they're going to help make your product a little bit softer, and they're also going to extend the shelf life a little bit. Now, if you're baking something that requires a much stronger structure like bread, you want to use higher protein content flours. You can also use things like dried egg whites, which is pretty much pure protein. Soy flour is high in protein. However, soy is a common allergen, so that's something that you kind of want to know and avoid if your customer also has an allergy to soy. White bean flour, because beans are high in protein, and bean flours also have the ability to trap a lot of gas when they're baking, so that they can, you know, they can have a good rise because it traps those gas bubbles. Dry whey powder is actually a byproduct of cheese making. Everybody knows that whey is that liquid that comes when you mix the cream for a long period of time and you make cheese. And that's basically just the liquid dried out, the water's evaporated, and you get the leftover. It's like pure protein. That's called whey powder. A lot of muscle builders and people who do fitness, they mix that into smoothies and stuff as a protein supplement. Don't forget about legumes, other different types of legumes. They have high protein, and they also have a lower glycemic index, which is great for people who have diabetes because they're trying to keep their glycemic index really low. Glycemic index is kind of a fancy way of talking about the level of carbohydrates that a product has. Questions?
Yes, please. I have a question.
Okay.
So if I have now original recipe for a cake and I would like to substitute for gluten-free, so I use the same amount, the flour like the gluten-free. If I have 100 grams, so it's the same with the gluten-free?
Usually, yes. You just want to make sure you're using the weight measurements and not volume. So definitely use a formula that is using either ounces or grams, not like cups or anything like that, because gluten-free flour replacements will have a different density than regular wheat flours. Like, let's say, for example, you're using a combination of white rice flour and chickpea flour. That white rice flour may have the kind of same density and weight as regular wheat flour, but that chickpea flour is going to be very wet and heavy. So you can't just like scoop for scoop, you've got to weight for weight. But generally speaking, gluten-free flour replacements are substituted weight for weight. But don't try it if you have a recipe that uses volume measurements. Does that make sense?
So it's also good to follow a recipe and not to create something from the, right? For the real recipe.
Well, you can create your own gluten-free flour blends if you have a list of the different types of gluten-free flours and what their functions are. You can create your own blends, but whatever you do, just make sure that you're using the substitute weight for weight. So if you have a cake formula that calls for 200 grams of regular cake flour, you would want to use your gluten-free substitute at 200 grams.
Okay.
Generally speaking. Now there are some exceptions because different types of gluten-free flour replacements will either absorb more liquid and some of them absorb less liquid. Like, let's say, for example, you're using nut-based gluten-free flour. Like, let's say you're trying to replace your wheat flour with almond meal, which is just ground up almonds. Ground up almonds are not going to absorb any liquid. So you need to know you need to kind of be aware of what, you know, what the functions of these particular ingredients are and what they're going to do. If we're making a cake batter and I need that flour replacement to absorb some of the liquid in my cake batter, I want to use a blend. Maybe I'll put some almond flour in there, but I'm also going to pick another gluten-free flour replacer that has a starchiness to it that's going to absorb some of that liquid. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And I've got some charts here, which I'm going to go into, and we'll talk more about the different options and what they do. So here you have a list of different types of gluten-free flours, and this is by no means all of them. This is probably just maybe like a little snippet, a fraction of what they are. But they'll talk about the type of gluten-free flour, the color, which is really important to know when you're making pastries. And it's also going to talk about the flavor. So for example, down here at the bottom, teff flour is brown and it tastes earthy. Now, if you don't really know what earthy means, think of like mushrooms. Mushrooms is, that's what we're talking about, like this earthy, like it just came right out of the ground type of, almost like a gross fungusy. I mean, I like mushrooms. I'm not saying mushrooms are gross, but we're going to have that type of flavor with this flour. Okay, so if you're trying to make like a gluten-free cupcake and you're like, oh, I have teff flour, I'm just going to use that. You're not making a white cupcake, that's for sure. And you're definitely not making a vanilla flavored cupcake either. You're making more of a mushroom flavored cupcake. So this flour in particular, teff flour, would be great to use in a chocolate recipe that has a whole bunch of other strong flavors in it that's going to help cover up that earthiness of that flour replacement. And there's all kinds of other flavors here, you know, you can look at with different colors. You know, you've got the white one, corn flour. White rice flour is going to have a white color, but a gritty texture. White rice flour doesn't really taste like anything. So anyway, this is just a good tool to have when you're baking gluten-free. Here's another one. Talks about the different protein contents of the flour and also the starchiness too. Okay, so you've got all kinds of different flours here. Some that we haven't even mentioned: sorghum flour, oat flour. Now it is very important to know that oats, conventionally grown and conventionally processed oats, are not gluten-free. They have to be processed in a gluten-free facility. So if you go to the grocery store and you just buy a can of oats, just because it's not a wheat product, don't assume that it's gluten-free. It needs to be stamped, certified gluten-free, and usually oats are not. So you need, if you're going to use oat flour replacement, you've got to use a certified gluten-free oat flour, because that's a product that's usually milled and processed in the same environment that they process wheat products. Okay. So anyway, this chart will come in handy if you're talking about like different types of proteins and starches. Here we have some gluten-free flour replacements that don't have anything to do with beans or whatever. You've got different types of nut flours. Coconut flour is a good one. Flaxseed meal and chia seed meals are not only great for adding nutritional content to your formula, but they also, when you mix them with water, they get sticky, and that is a good way to replace kind of the structural aspect of the gluten, is by creating kind of like a sticky substance, and you can achieve that with the flaxseed meal and the chia seed meal as well. Here's some more. Cassava flour, arrowroot starch, tiger nut flour. That's one that we don't see very often. That's an African root that is ground up, gluten-free. Okay. So just do your research. You know, before you start baking, do your research. Spend a few days reading books, looking on the internet, gathering as much information as you can about all the different types of flours, and maybe you can make your own chart. You can kind of cross-reference it against the color, the texture, the protein content, the starch content, the flavor. All of those types of topics are good to know when you're dealing with these flour replacements. Here's something that's also important to know. Hide your colloids That's a product that creates a gel-like substance when you mix it with moisture or water. So like gelatin, for example, when you mix it with water, it gets really thick and gooey, and it's going to help things stick together. So there's a list of many different hydrocolloids that are frequently found in gluten-free baking because they kind of replicate that sticky, stretchy substance that the man showed you in the video. So if you are trying to make a product that requires a lot of structure, you might consider adding one of these products to help achieve, you know, that extensibility and that structure that you're missing from the wheat flour too. They are usually pretty pricey, like especially the xanthan gum, the agar powder, the guar gum, but they really do help with the structure building. They're generally found in artisan gluten-free breads too. Gelatin powder is probably one of the cheaper varieties there, but I would say for the more often than not, I see xanthan gum, flaxseed meal, and guar gum as the main hydrocolloids that are in gluten-free flour blends. You also have egg whites, which are pretty much 100% protein, and they will help trap air bubble or gas bubbles so that you get that oven spring. They'll give your product a lot of structure because the proteins coagulate when you bake them. They're sticky too, so they'll help your product, the dough or the batter, they'll help that bind together when you're mixing it. And then you have additional leaveners that you might need to add to your product too in order to help them rise up in the oven, because you might not have the trapping of the gas bubbles the way you normally would. So you might want to add a little bit of extra chemical leavener. But it is important to know that not all baking powders are gluten-free, because as we know, baking powder is basically baking soda and cream of tartar or tartaric acid. They're mixed together, but there's a starch in there that helps them from like sticking together and creating kind of like a ball. So the starch needs to be gluten-free. Make sure that when you're buying your baking powder, it says gluten-free on there if you're going to be using gluten-free products. That's something that not a lot of people know, is that baking powder is not always gluten-free because of that starch that's added to help two ingredients from sticking together. Here is a recipe for gluten-free flour blend written by the Culinary Institute of America, highly tested. And this is great for cakes and pastries because it has a lower protein content. And I will attach this slideshow to the class page so you can have it if you want to. And you just take these ingredients and you just mix them up together. Sift them really well, mix them up, use your whisk and whisk them. Then you can put them in a Ziploc bag, and then you can have your own gluten-free flour blend. You would probably want to store it in the refrigerator because sometimes these types of products go rancid, especially if they have fat in them. Like buckwheat flour is known for having some fat, and if you store it at room temperature for too long, it will go rancid. Okay. And then here's another one for products that require more protein and more structure. So these gluten-free products will have a higher protein content. You see we've got some dried egg whites in there. We've got the soy, which is high in protein, or the bean flour. You've got this whey powder down here, which is almost pure protein. Then you have this hydrocolloid that we just talked about, which is going to help give even more structure to your product. You've got the potato starch, which is just starch, and it's going to kind of lighten the product up a little bit and extend the shelf life. And then the white rice flour, which is the bulk of the bread dough. And that is it. That's it. How do I stop? There you go. What do you think? Nothing? Questions, comments, experiences, concerns? No? Okay. So much to learn about gluten-free. It really is. And a really important thing to know is that you're not going to get it right the first time. It takes a lot of experience, a lot of trial and error, a lot of experimentation. You're not just going to go out there and find a recipe that has exactly what you need. It's just depending on your environment too, depending on your altitude, where you live, the humidity level. What works for some people who live at 5,000 feet in Colorado in a drier atmosphere is not going to work the same as where I live at sea level, where it's hot and humid pretty much all the time. Even if it's written in a book, even if it's a gluten-free recipe that somebody swears by, it's not always the same. Okay, so let's talk about the assignment real quick. You are making a gluten-free cake. Okay, so as usual, you're going to want your picture, your self-ID, sanitizer, your mise en place, all right, and then all the steps. I'm going to play the video for you, and then we're going to go back to this so you're kind of more familiar with what the steps are, but it's going to be a gluten-free cake. And I will say down here that number 10 says a finished product plated for professional presentation. That kind of basically means more than just putting the cake on a plate. Make it like it's a plated dessert that you're going to serve somebody in a restaurant. It doesn't have to be super fancy, but maybe you could put a little sauce with it, or a scoop of whipped cream, a little handful of fruit somewhere on there. Okay, just don't put a piece of cake on a plate and call it a day. You want to kind of dress it up a little bit. So let's look at the video.
Flourless chocolate cake is a rich, dense cake made from an aerated chocolate custard. The eggs are whipped into a foam and then stabilized with melted chocolate. Because the preparation completely omits flour, this is a popular gluten-free dessert option. To start off, preheat the oven to 325 degrees and prepare a half sheet pan with lightly sprayed parchment paper. Then, using a bain-marie, melt the butter and chocolate.
It's important that you actually use a half sheet pan if you're making this particular recipe, because that is the way the recipe was written. If you use a smaller sheet pan or like a larger vessel of some sort, you're going to end up with either like a really thick cake that's going to take a different time to bake. That's what's written in the formula. Or you're going to end up with something that's like super thin and it's going to burn if you leave it in the oven for 20 minutes. So if you are making this formula, do make sure that you're using a half sheet pan, or you could cut the formula in half and use a quarter sheet pan if that's what you have. I know that some people don't have the larger pans at home, you just have the smaller ones. But I will say that if you don't have a quarter sheet pan or a half sheet pan, you could break this recipe in half and bake it inside of a round cake pan too, like a 10-inch or an 8-inch, and that would work. That would work just fine as well.
Chocolate, being sure that the bowl doesn't come into contact with the hot water. We'll turn it on medium heat, about 1 inch of water in there so that it slowly melts. We don't want it to boil, you just slow melt on it.
All right, so she is stirring this over a double boil.
When it's almost melted, turn off the heat and
the water is just kind of at a simmer. You don't want to scorch your chocolate. Don't be like boiling the water and putting the chocolate up there, because the chocolate is going to burn.
Allow it to rest and cool down. You want to let it cool for about 20 minutes before you begin to add in any of the other eggs, because we don't want the eggs to coagulate. Then
that's a very important step, is allowing the chocolate to cool. A lot of people forget to do that and just dump the eggs right in there. But if you dump the eggs right in there, you're going to end up with a really gross concoction of melted chocolate and scrambled eggs.
In a large mixing bowl, we're going to whisk our egg yolks and the first sugar together. We're just going to whisk them until they're combined and there's no visible streaks of eggs, but we don't need to overdo it. The stand mixer with the whip attachment, add the egg whites and remaining sugar and whip it until it reaches medium peaks. So now we're going to fold our chocolate and butter mixture into our egg yolk and sugar mixture until it's fully incorporated.
I think I skipped through that part accidentally, but she folded the egg yolks and the sugar into the melted chocolate after it cooled down a little bit. Just dump it right in there and mix it up. You don't have to be super gentle with it. The part of this recipe that you do have to be gentle with is folding the meringue into the melted chocolate and egg mixture so that you don't deflate the meringue.
You want to whisk it until you don't see any streaks remaining, and it will thicken up. Be sure to go around the sides of the bowl. Also make sure you're hitting the center of the bowl as well. Last thing we'll do is gently fold in the meringue into the chocolate, butter, and egg yolk mixture. Before we add any more, make sure you're stirring very gently with this around the sides of the bowl, up and over with your spatula. If we press too hard at this, it'll deflate the mixture.
So you want to add your meringue in maybe 3 to 4 additions. Don't just dump it in there all at once. Take a scoop and fold it in, take another scoop and fold it in. You're going to find that you're going to end up with a much smoother batter if you do it that way. And you're not going to overmix it in terms of creating gluten and making it tough because this is gluten-free. There's no flour in there. Just don't overmix it and deflate all those air bubbles.
Which we don't want to do, so. Now your cake batter is ready to be put into your prepared half-sheet pan. You want to make sure it's lined with parchment paper so that it doesn't stick, and then we'll lightly spray the top.
Make sure your spray is gluten-free if you're serving it to somebody. A lot of times they're not, so check the label. Sometimes baking sprays have
Make sure you
flour
also
in
get the rims of the sheet pan as well. Yet. Light pressure, we don't want to deflate the mixture. We just want to make sure that it's uniform in the sheet pan. The center is set. The doneness can be checked by gently jiggling the pan and seeing if the center has any movement or not. This should take anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes. Or frozen for up to 1 month. To ease chocolate cake can be refrigerated overnight or frozen for up to 1 month. To easily slice the cake, run a knife under hot water, dry it, and cut while the knife is still warm. This will make the cuts smooth and visually pleasing. This cake can also be garnished with powdered sugar, fresh berries, and whipped cream. It can also be glazed for a shiny presentation.
See, you don't have to break the bank and buy all kinds of extra stuff to decorate this plate up. Just a little scoop of whipped cream and some fresh fruit on there. If you've got leftover jam from week 1, you can use that too because chocolate goes with lots and lots of different flavors. So just have fun with it. You know, it doesn't have to look any particular way. Just make it pretty. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I lost the class page. So back to the assignment. Finished product on the plate for presentation. So dress it up a little bit. Okay. Any questions about what's included, what you need to include on in your assignment? What kind of photos? Okay, make sure you're showing us all the steps, the meringue, the butter melted, the bowl with the egg yolks and the sugar mixed together, all those different steps. Okay, it's important to know in this recipe that chocolate, when it's melted, is kind of liquidy, obviously, but when chocolate cools down, just like when butter is melted and it cools down, it gets hard again. So if you feel like this particular recipe is like raw when you pull it out of the oven and it's been in there for 20 minutes, remember that as it cools down, it's gonna firm up because the chocolate is going to get cool and the chocolate's gonna firm up when it cools. So just like a brownie, you pull it out kind of before you think it's done, and then as it cools down, the chocolate, you know, tightens it back up again. So here's your recipe. You just got the semi-sweet chocolate, and you can use any type of semi-sweet. It doesn't have to be couverture or anything. Just chocolate chips that you find in the baking aisle at the store. Melt them with your butter. Separately whisk the egg yolk and the granulated sugar together. Make a medium peak meringue out of these two ingredients. Fold the melted chocolate and butter into the yolks and sugar until it's smooth, and then fold in the meringue. It's really pretty easy. It is. You can save part of this too. If you can save it for our final presentation, which is going to be a trio of plated desserts. So if this turns out really nice and you don't want to use it all up or eat it or throw it in the garbage can, you can save it and put it in the freezer. Just wrap it really tightly, and then you can actually utilize it for your final presentation as well. Any questions? Somebody says yolks, not whites. Thought chef said egg whites. You have both in the recipe. You've got yolks that are mixed with sugar, and then you've got whites that are mixed with sugar to make a meringue. You've got three parts of the recipe. You've got melted chocolate and butter. You've got egg yolks and sugar whisked together, and then you've got egg whites and sugar whisked together to make a meringue, and then all three of those kind of get folded together. This is a flourless chocolate cake. There's not really any other way to make this a different flavor. Now, there are a ton of recipes out there for different types of flourless cakes. I see a lot for orange flourless cake, but this one here doesn't have any sort of flour replacements. As you notice, there was nothing in there to replace the flour. It's not like they added rice flour or anything. You know, so but most of them do. This one, the stabilizer in this one is the egg whites and the egg yolks, because they're going to coagulate when you bake them, and then it's also the chocolate. This is kind of like a chocolate ganache cake in that when, you know, the chocolate cools down, it's going to re-solidify, and that's also a structural component of this cake. Your assignment is to make a flourless chocolate cake. It doesn't have to be this recipe. But don't go out there and just make any gluten-free recipe. The assignment is to make flourless chocolate cake, okay? If you happen to find a flourless white chocolate cake recipe that you want to use, fine. But that's the assignment, is to make a flourless chocolate cake. Milk chocolate might be okay for this recipe as long as it's a good quality milk chocolate. I wouldn't recommend it, but you have to remember that the three different types of chocolate, the dark chocolate, the milk chocolate, and the white chocolate, they all have different fat percentages, so they're going to set up differently. Like if I just had a bowl full of melted dark chocolate and a bowl full of melted milk chocolate and then white chocolate, when they set up, they're going to be different firmness. Like the white chocolate is going to be really soft, the milk chocolate is going to be soft but a little bit more firm, and the dark chocolate is going to be a lot more firm because it's got less cocoa butter in it. And white chocolate is pretty much all cocoa butter, and milk chocolate has some cocoa butter and some cocoa solids. So don't think that the three different chocolates are like interchangeable, because they're not, especially when you're relying on the chocolate to be part of the structural components of your recipe. We're a little bit over on time here, and I can keep talking for like 5 more minutes, but if anybody needs to leave, you can go. Any more questions? Does Chef Rose have anything to add?
So basically, there's a lot of questions in the chat that I wanted to address. This formula is using semi-sweet chocolate, so definitely would suggest to use that. You can switch out other chocolates, but it is going to make it different, and it's going to taste a lot different. If you use a dark chocolate, it's going to make it very bitter, and it's not going to taste very good in a cake form, so definitely would not suggest that, but you can definitely find a dark chocolate cake recipe, gluten-free cake recipe, if that's something that you're interested in, if you're not really a fan of the semi-sweet. I know Felicia was asking because she's not really a fan of chocolate. This recipe uses chocolate. It's very commonly used. I've used it in several different kitchens that I've worked in, and so definitely would suggest learning this at least and using this for your assignment. But you can definitely find other types of gluten-free cakes if that's something that you're more interested in. But for this assignment, I need to see that you guys make a gluten-free or a flourless chocolate cake for this assignment. So no other gluten-free options.
Good. Yes, that's very important. Just stick with flourless chocolate cake for this one. If you find a different recipe, that's fine. I would suggest not just using any random recipe from the internet. I actually had a big problem in my cake class with some people using random recipes. They're not all created equal. They're not all good, and they're not all going to turn out right. So don't just look at something and think it's okay. You can pass it by us to see what we think. Make sure you read through it to make sure it's not like wonky in any way. They're not telling you to do something that you know is wrong, or all of a sudden you're making this recipe and it calls for like 6 pounds of chocolate. Obviously that would be a typo, but you go through with it and then you waste your product and you're like, why is this like chocolate soup? Okay, so any recipe you want to use is fine. Just make sure it's a good one. You can check with us first on that and just make sure it's a flourless chocolate cake recipe. It's good to learn this technique first before you start delving into the rest of the gluten-free world, especially because this particular type of product is so widely used, gluten-free chocolate cake. Kendra's got to go. Thanks for coming. And just like Chef Rose said, and like I said earlier, all chocolate is not created equal. They have different sweetness levels, different fat content. Their structure is going to be different. So whereas dark chocolate and semi-sweet chocolate might set up the same in a recipe, they don't taste the same. One's going to be sweeter than the other. One's going to be bitter in flavor. One's going to be sweet in flavor. Okay, milk chocolate and white chocolate too. They're very, very high in fat, and one's going to be super, super sweet. One's going to be a little bit less sweet, but neither one of them are going to set your product up the way that it should be. And they're going to cause your product to be a lot more liquidy than they would be normally. Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, I will attach that presentation to the class page so you can at least have the list of the different types of flours to use in the future and those recipes that are down at the end for gluten-free flour blends. And if you have any other questions or comments, just make sure that you let us know. Don't forget you have a discussion this week, which is about gluten-free and what you think of it and if it affects your life and how you think it's going to affect your professional career as a baker. And just have fun, enjoy, and I will say goodbye. You guys have a very good day.
Bye everyone, have a good day.
Bye-bye.